You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. All right. Thanks, Max. I'm sure some of you noticed this week, or actually it was a few weeks ago, that there was the blessing of a 22-foot golden statue in Florida recently. This is, of course, a golden statue of Donald Trump blessed by a group of clergy, interfaith community. Actually, this was an interfaith blessing. Both some Christian clergy and Jewish clergy were there. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, really. There was actually a lot of blowback for this. I don't know if you noticed from the evangelical community. You even had, evangelicals coming out and saying, maybe this is a step too far. Maybe this is a bit idolatrous. To which the Christian clergy, the lead pastor involved with the blessing of the golden statue of Trump, responded by saying, well, it's not like we worshiped the statue. This wasn't a golden calf. To which I saw some reply, if you have to say it wasn't a golden calf, then it was definitely a golden calf, right? Which, if you don't know, the golden calf reference is a reference to a story in the Old Testament where the Israelites were told during the Exodus, melted down their golden jewelry in order to fashion a calf, an idol of the Canaanite deity Baal, which appeared in the form of a young bull. Okay. This whole episode got me thinking about idolatry recently and how so many Christians don't know that Christianity actually began, in large part, as a critique of idols. Not just a critique of the idols that were plentiful around the Greco-Roman world at that time. As you might know, there was a lot of worship of the Greek and the Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. But Christianity began also, in large part, as a critique of the idol of religious law that was carried on in a significant portion of first century Judaism at the time. A careful reading of the New Testament reveals that early Christians saw themselves as a reaction, in large part, to the pervasive idolatry of the Greco-Roman world, and also not just externally from them, but internally within the first century Jewish tradition. Remember, early Christians, the first Christians, were all Jews. And they saw themselves as practicing a kind of non-idolatrous religion in a world full of idolatry. So much so that early Christians were actually called atheists. I don't know if you know that, but early Christians were actually called atheists because they didn't believe in the Roman pantheon or the Greek pantheon or even the divinity of the emperor, the Roman emperor. They were called atheists for this because they didn't believe in any god save one, who for them had no image or form that he could be represented in. For them, their understanding of God was pure spirit. And perhaps the best example of this is found in the book of Acts, right? With Paul going into Athens, we're told, and observing, he does the guided tour, I guess. He walks around town and he sees all these idols and altars to all these deities. There was even one altar inscribed to the unknown God. The Greeks really wanted to cover all their bases, and they thought, well, maybe there's a God we're not aware of. Let's make an altar for that one too. And so Paul goes to the place, the Areopagus, it was known. It was a place for debate and engagement with, philosophers, I guess. And he's there, and he basically says, let me tell you about my God. He's greater than all the others that I see around town here, which ironically, by the way, is a kind of a idolatrous thing for him to say, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But he says that the Christian God is the greatest God because he doesn't live in a temple made by human hands. He doesn't come in the form of an idol made by someone out of gold or silver. Rather, he's the maker of heaven and earth, and he's the one who gives breath and life to all things. For in him we live and move and have our being. And this story is the perfect example, really, of early Christianity's original critique of idols. But again, early Christianity functioned not just as a critique of idols outside of itself, in the Greco-Roman world against the gods and goddesses therein, but perhaps even more so, it functioned as a critique of the idols of religious law and religious tradition that existed within first century Judaism. Early Jewish Christians like Paul and even Jesus himself critiqued the idolatrous relationship many of their contemporaries had with the Mosaic law, the scriptures, and their traditions and practices. According to Jesus and Paul and others, religious law and religious tradition often function like a false god, a fetish, if you will, that allowed people to perform acts of piety, like going to temple, making sacrifices, observing the Sabbath, and feeling really holy and righteous about that. And yet, over here, they're neglecting the poor. They're doing violence. They're participating in systems of injustice. There's this deep kind of hypocrisy to it all. And Jesus was very clear about this, was he not, in the Gospels? The Jesus we find in the Gospels, he was very clear that such people knew nothing about the ways of God. Such people knew nothing about the kingdom of God. No matter how holy and righteous they might have seemed on the outside, he described them as whitewashed tombs, right? Really pretty on the outside, but full of everything corrupt and decaying on the interior. In essence, they were practicing a false religion. They were practicing idolatry from his point of view. And to be clear, Jesus did not critique the law of Moses itself, but rather he critiqued the strict, burdensome, and hypocritical interpretations of it taught by many of the religious authorities of his day. His teachings emphasized the original and general intent of the law, which he believed was love and compassion and justice. This is what we find in the Gospels, is it not? Right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Paul, of course, comes along a few years after Jesus and takes this critique of the idol of religious law to the next level. I mean, he ratchets it up. And even though Paul argues in his letters and believed that the law of Moses was a necessary thing and a good thing, he came to have this, I mean, if you read him, he came to have this very adversarial relationship to it and those who relied on it. And perhaps the best example of this is found in Galatians chapter 5, where he says this, "Mark my words." I love how he begins this. "Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised," speaking, of course, to men here, right? And we all know that circumcision is like the high watermark of, practicing, the Mosaic law, right? "I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated now to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ," he says. "You have fallen away from grace. For in Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Period." End quote. I mean, those are some harsh words about, you practicing religious law, you adhering to religious law. And in the same chapter, he says, "If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." Do you hear that? If you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. The law means nothing to you. And the way he understood what it meant to be led by the Spirit is to be led by love. As he says just a few verses later here in Galatians 5, "For the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness." So to be led by the Spirit is to be led by love for Paul, period. That's it. Whereas to be led by the law is to be led by religion. And for Paul, that's no good. It needs to be done away with from his point of view because it keeps us from living by the Spirit. It keeps us from living by love. It keeps us from living as Christ in the world. It keeps us from maturing spiritually. It keeps us from realizing who we really are as children of God, not children of religious law. I don't think a lot of people understand just how iconoclastic that was for someone like Paul to say. He knew he was flying in the face of centuries of teaching about the Mosaic Law. He knew he was flying in the face of this core first century Jewish conviction about the primacy of Mosaic law. He knew what he was saying. He knew what he was doing. He knew he was saying that the law was somehow lesser than or made obsolete by this notion of living by the Spirit, but he believed he had to say it anyway. He believed he had to say such things. He believed he had to critique and deconstruct, if you will, the idol of religious law. Our old friend Dietrich Bonhoeffer noticed this too. I'm not the first person to notice this stuff. In 1944, 1945, he wrote this from his Nazi prison cell. Paul's question whether circumcision is a condition of justification seems to me in present day terms to be whether or not religion is necessary for salvation. Freedom from circumcision is freedom from religion, end quote. Again, I'm not the first person to notice these things. Christians have over the centuries. The critique of idols, especially the idol of religion and religious law, is at the very heart of Christianity. It's at the very heart of it. It's ironic, therefore, that the church over the centuries reinscribed a kind of religious law in the form of creedalism, sacramentalism, bibliolatry, and emotive belief. What do those words mean? You might be wondering. Well, creedalism is this idea, the requirement that everyone confess the same creed, right? The same statement of belief about the nature of the divinity, Jesus' virgin birth, his divinity, his atoning death on the cross, his bodily resurrection, his ascension on high, and his soon return to judge the living and the dead. The most popular creed we have, of course, is the Nicene Creed, dating to the 4th century, and it has been used ever since then and still used today in many churches as the standard, the thing you have to confess in order to be a Christian, in order to be in the church, in order to be saved. That's creedalism. Sacramentalism is this belief that the sacraments, like water baptism and the Lord's Supper, is also necessary for salvation and to be included in the family of God. Bibliolatry means the worship of the Bible, the virtual worship of it through believing that it is the inerrant, infallible Word of God, that everything we believe hangs on. And if you do not affirm the Bible's inerrancy and infallibility, you're not a real Christian because everything else hangs on this idea. That's bibliolatry. And then finally, emotive belief. Emotive belief means one must emote feelings of certainty about all of these beliefs and supernatural claims regarding Jesus, God, and the Bible. Emotive belief, I was taught, emotive belief is faith. Faith is certainty. If you do not feel certain or certain enough about the core doctrines of Christianity, if you instead feel doubt, or God forbid, you feel unbelief, you're in big trouble, right? You were taught this, perhaps. Faith is certainty, we're taught. Faith is emotive belief in the core doctrines of the faith, which you hold in your head, and you emote feelings of certainty in them, or else you commit thought crime. And the creator of the universe is watching carefully. And if you don't emote certainty in certain claims about his metaphysical and supernatural nature, you are doomed to a fate worse than death. This is emotive belief, of course. Yeah. I hope you notice that this is not actually a departure from religious law, but a subtle reinscribing of it under the guise of faith and emotive belief and a new set of traditions and practices that you have to adhere to or else. Not that there's anything wrong with traditions and practices, right? I'm all for traditions and practices. We have traditions and practices. You just being here on a Sunday morning is a tradition. It is a spiritual practice. Physically just coming here. Right? We partake in the Lord's Supper every week. Nothing wrong with traditions and practices, but they can become idolatrous if we give them too much power, which again is really ironic that the church did this. Is it not ironic? Christianity is a religion built on the critique of idols. And yet here we see how it became idolatrous. It traded in living by the Spirit for living by religious law again. What happened? And we can talk about what happened later on if you want. I don't want to go down that rabbit trail right now, but what I want to simply say now is that I think we are reclaiming here at Central and in other churches like this one, this original Christian idea of what it means to live by the Spirit. This Pentecost Sunday, it's a good way to talk about that. What does it mean to live by the Spirit? Well, again, going back to even Paul's writings in Galatians 5, it means to live by love, this commitment to compassion and love and togetherness and connection and justice. And this is what it means to live by the Spirit. That which enhances human well-being and human flourishing, being committed to that, living out that in relationship to each other. I'd like to think we are reclaiming the original iconoclastic nature of Christianity here and its critique of idols. In fact, one could say progressive Christianity in general and the larger deconstruction movement, of which so many of us are a part of or came out of, that this is born actually out of this original Christian practice of critiquing idols. Today, that means critiquing evangelicalism and fundamentalism and the blessing of 22-foot golden statues of Donald Trump, right? That's kind of what it looks like today. But to be clear, even progressive Christianity can become idolatrous. Anything can become an idol if we give it too much power. I think it's a lot harder for progressive Christianity to become idolatrous because it's so intrinsically deconstructive and distrustful of high control religion, right? It's got like an allergic reaction to it. It's extremely suspicious of any pastor, any spiritual leader telling you what to believe and think, right? So it's hard for progressive Christianity to become idolatrous or cult-like. But there are progressive churches that I would say still harbor a kind of idolatrous relationship to the faith. And it sounds like this. Here's what it sounds like. Christianity is all about love and justice. Yes. And we affirm the LGBTQ community here. We say Black Lives Matter. We're all for women in ministry. We're against Christian nationalism. But we still believe that Christianity, Jesus, and the Bible is the supreme revelation of God. And everyone should therefore become a Christian. All other religions are somewhat inferior to ours. And, you won't go to hell for not being a Christian. But here's the thing. You're going to miss out on God's best for your life. Christianity is the path to ultimate fulfillment. And one must believe in and worship our God in order to have the most blessed life possible. Our God is the only real God, and he's a God of real power and might that can be counted on to intervene in our lives and save the day and heal us and protect us and help us achieve our dreams and goals. That is, of course, only if we pray enough and worship him enough and believe enough and go to church, walk the right path. So you better become a Christian because we've got the answers here. We've got the way. Other ways, okay, you're not going to go to hell, but we've got the best way. Our God's supreme. Our God reigns. Okay, I hope you can hear how that's kind of idolatrous, right? It's the kind of prosperity gospel message found in progressive churches, right? Jesus is here to help you achieve your dreams and goals. That plays really well in Los Angeles and churches all across LA that are quasi-progressive, And I don't want to be hypercritical about that. Some of that's harmless, but I found that it's not always harmless. And it can keep people from a higher level of freedom and a higher level of consciousness, I would say. And this is why I like the work of Peter Rollins and Jack Caputo and the whole radical theology movement, because they articulate an understanding of idolatry that includes progressive and liberal Christianity. They define idolatry as whatever we use to cover over and escape the difficult truth of our lives, primarily that we are finite and mortal beings destined to suffer and die, and nothing can change that. We also struggle to find meaning and purpose and fulfillment in life, and yet it eludes us. And so in order to cope with these difficult truths, we often turn to religion or some form of spirituality in the hopes of finding peace and fulfillment. Thus, these things can become an idol, a sacred object that promises us satisfaction and wholeness, but can't actually deliver it, because nothing can. Perfect satisfaction, peace, and fulfillment isn't possible. You will always feel somewhat dissatisfied, unwhole, estranged, alienated. That's the human condition. Nothing is going to fix that. And it's not possible because we are lacking and imperfect beings living in a lacking and imperfect world. And so often religion presents itself as the ultimate solution to this problem, right? It presents itself as the thing that has all the answers and will make us whole, but it can't, even if it's progressive and liberal Christianity. The trick is, here's the trick, right? You got to embrace this truth. You got to make peace with this difficult truth, with the fact that there is no deity, no church, no religion, no pastor, no guru, no philosophy, no metaphysics that can give us all the answers or grant us perfect peace and fulfillment. This is a difficult thing to face. But here's the good news. There is good news. Here's the good news. Once we make peace with this fact, with this difficult truth, we can find some serenity in the aftermath. We can find some wholeness in the lack, some peace in the chaos, some satisfaction in our dissatisfaction. In other words, we can learn to be okay about not being okay. Right? This is kind of the lesson of recovery. For those of you familiar with recovery programs, the message is not, you can be whole and everything's going to be wonderful. No, the message is you can make peace with life as it really is, in all of its frailty and difficulty. But, a lot of people go to church, they don't want to hear that message. They want to have a quick fix. They want to be told, believe this. Here's the answers. I'm here to say that's enough. It really is. It's enough. You are enough, just as you are. You are enough. Love is enough. Togetherness is enough. This life is enough. This world is enough. And the sooner we realize this, the better I think that is. And this is where the critique of idols ultimately leads. At least that's where it's led me. And this is why, and I'll finish with this. This is why I have a problem with Paul's words in Athens that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. He was kind of idolatrous when he basically says to the Athenians, I've walked around town and I've seen your altars and your idols, and I'm here to tell you that your gods are bullshit. My God is the only real God, and until you get on board with me and my religion, your life's going to suck or whatever. You've missed the boat. I've got the answers. Here they are. Time to convert. No, I think the really non-idolatrous thing that he could have said would be something like, none of us have the one true religion. Doesn't exist, because religions are human constructs and approximations at naming what is fundamentally unnameable, the ineffable, the transcendent, the divine, the spirit. And that doesn't mean our spiritual traditions and religions are bad or worthless, but it does mean we must learn to hold on to them differently and with humility, with a kind of curiosity and even playfulness and openness, and be willing to critique them where needed. In this way, we realize that it's ultimately love and our connections with each other and the world around us that makes us spiritual people, people who realize our innate divinity and the innate divinity of others, regardless of their social location, regardless of their religious or cultural identity. This is what the most non-idolatrous spiritual thing you can say is, I think. This is where the critique of idols, I think, the Christian project of the critique of idols ultimately leads, I think, if we follow it down its path, leads to a kind of self-deconstruction or self-destruction, if you want to put it that way, of itself, where it admits that I don't have the answers as a Christian either. This is my construct. This is my tradition. It's beautiful. I like it. Works for me. Gives me a vocabulary. The stories, the traditions, we gather and we make community around these things. We explore what it means to be spiritual people around, but they are constructs nonetheless. And ultimately, what it means to be the children of God, divine beings, is love and connection and mutuality and solidarity, togetherness, and building a better world for each other that promotes and human flourishing, etc. Right? This would have been the non-idolatrous thing for Paul to say. For Paul to say in Athens, he would never say it because he was a man of his time, right? He was a person of his time, just like we are in ours. But I am convinced this is where the critique of idols ultimately leads. It doesn't just change how we look at one religion or the religion of others. It changes how we look at ourselves and our own tradition, our own religion, just as Paul reflected back on his own Jewish tradition and critiqued the idols therein. He should have taken it into Christianity as well, instead of being like, oh no, this is the thing. We've got it now. This is the thing. No. This is where the critique of idols leads. It leads to a place of freedom and love and a higher level of consciousness where we can fully affirm everybody, regardless of their social location. And I hope that is freeing for you and life-giving and something that promotes your spirituality. All right, there's my talk for this morning. And as always, we want to open it up for dialogue and discussion or questions, reflections. What's your take on the critique of idols? Yeah, Jason.
I was just thinking about how it's kind of a shame that the Bible isn't filled with descriptions and stories about active love. It's like kind of mentioned in passing. Like there's a couple of stories. There's like Lazarus and Jesus. There's, references to like, and they went out and ministered to the poor or whatever, but there's no like big descriptions of actually living out the prescriptions in the Bible. Like most of Paul's stuff is like, here's what you should do, but show me, there's,
I see, like an actual story.
Yeah. Where is the story of him exhibiting love?
Yeah.
Or, like actually living the faith that he's talking about. It's still legalism. He's just writing what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah.
In all the books. And even like the stories of Jesus, like there's, he's feeding, he's healing, whatever. But the point of the books or of the stories are the message and the to-dos rather than just like examples. I feel like I wish there were more examples.
Yeah, no, I feel you. And I think the Gospels contain more of those stories of Jesus's doings in that regard. But Paul was deeply, those letters were written to theologize everything and to basically, here's the theory. Here's my theory on the law and why you need to think and believe this way rather than that way.
Yeah.
Here's how you do church, kind of, Yeah, you're right. That was that. But that's the context of the epistles. He's writing letters to like specific churches to tell them, no, you're supposed to be doing this and not that.
And I guess, and you're right. And I guess there were probably a lot more books. A lot of them didn't make it in, and it's the lawyers that put the Bible together.
Your critique's fair. Yeah, no, your critique's fair.
They picked the books that had law in it.
Yeah, and the Gospels were written. Most scholars, I think, New Testament scholars believe the Gospels were written as early cultic mythology meant to inform a practicing community with the stories about Jesus, but also to give them, sort of this kind of cultic mythology to back up his divinity claims and whatnot. And it wasn't meant necessarily to teach them, what to do so much. It was more of just like, here's who this man was. Here's what you can believe about him. Here's how he was divine, But, we still find, as you pointed out, stories of him feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, or at least healing the sick and performing works that were altruistic,
Yeah.
and high ethical standards. Loving. Yeah. No, I wish there was more stories like you described. Other thoughts today? Critique of idols.
I'll just speak briefly in defense of Paul.
Yeah. How dare you? I thought I was actually saying some nice things about Paul today. I'll be honest. I felt that way. All right, go ahead, Abe. Sorry.
One of the things I think is very interesting about Paul's writings, it's like, I think it's useful to remember that he's writing at a time where religion is highly, highly ritualized, even among Jews, especially in the Roman world, and was overwhelmingly, and to a degree that we can't really comprehend, an instrument of control of the authorities. So all these rituals, all these feast days that you take part in, the sacrifices that you bring to the temple,
Yeah.
all of them, everything you do signifies your obedience to God, but really to the authorities or the people that represent God. In the case of the Romans, that would be the emperor and the imperial authorities. In the case of the Jews, it's the high priests and the scribes and all the sort of people that control the temple. And I think what's really interesting that Paul introduces, that I think is like a genuinely, to a degree, he's inspired by Greek philosophy and some of that kind of stuff. But I think he really synthesizes something genuinely new, which is the notion of individualized belief. And that means something, that it isn't your practice, the fact that you're circumcised. It isn't the fact that you adhere to a certain code of laws, or that you show up at the temple when you're supposed to with the proper sacrifice, or any of those things. That it is just simple belief, and faithfulness to God, and whatever that sort of mysterious thing is. And he doesn't even really define it that well.
I know. Yeah.
He just uses a word, and he somewhat redefines what that word is, on his own terms.
Yeah.
But the important thing is he individualizes it, and we really all exist at a time after that has had all these past 2,000 years, really are in a time where there's this notion of my own individual belief matters, not that of my father, because even that counted for more. If you were, a woman or a child, it was really your father's belief, or your father's sort of fidelity to the law, or to the Roman authorities, that mattered in a religious sense, And so that notion of like individual belief and the empowerment of an individual, I think, is really profound, and I think is really kind of, for all of his faults, I think is sort of a genuinely important and amazing thing that seemingly, because I don't think it's necessarily even that present in the Gospels, that notion. I think Paul really kind of codifies that.
I think you're absolutely right. And I wonder how much of Greco-Roman philosophy played into that idea of this, not the supremacy of the individual, but this kind of heightened understanding or respect for the individual's mind and choice. And I like what you said about we don't really understand how Paul really understood words like faith. Sometimes it seems like he's talking about emotive belief. Other times it seems like he's talking about allegiance or faithfulness to a way of being. And it's really nebulous about what he meant. And he probably meant different things in different contexts with that word pistis, right?
Yeah.
That Greek word. I mean, I wrestled this week with this talk because I don't really understand what Paul always meant by faith. And I'm not sure he always understood what he meant by it. And I'm not sure the Pauline school of thought wasn't necessarily Paul, but it was a Pauline school that wrote some of these texts that, they were working with a different set of metaphysical ideas about faith and individual access to the divine through their own. It's fascinating, but it's problematic. And I do wonder if how much of the evangelical notion today of my personal relationship with Jesus is grounded in that Pauline idea, but Paul never meant maybe that.
Yeah.
You have to have a personal relationship with Jesus, and that becomes very problematic. So, but you're right, Abe. There is something about Paul that made it very about you and what you think and what you do, and really, and that you have this connection. Yeah, it's fascinating. Other thoughts today?
I just think in connection with that, there's a lot I don't like about Paul. And then at the same time, I have to remember, like you're talking about, is the kind of radical transformation that happens in the person of Paul is like unprecedented.
Yeah,
Like Paul's advocacy for like the faith that we see in the Bible would be like if Pete Hegseth came out and said, I've seen the light, war is immoral,
yeah,
we should shut down ICE and have universal health care. Like that's how drastically dramatic the change of Paul is. And so there's a bunch of stuff I don't like about it, but I like he's maybe the most radical thinker in the entire Bible, which is crazy to think about. So anyways, I just think that you reminded me of that too, like how, Paul is just this really bizarre person to be preserved in the Bible through letters, like just addressing, not giving us like a formal statement of faith or beliefs, but just like writing letters to churches he was angry at because he started them and they were doing things he didn't like. So they're like weird, the picture of Paul that we have. But yeah, anyways, I really like the way that you kind of reframe it. And one of the things I was thinking about is your whole talk here is that in some ways it kind of leads me to a place of going like, oh wow, so the end game is really just deconstruct it all, get rid of everything, and we don't need it. But that's not what you're saying
no,
at all.
no,
And one of the things that I find really hopeful is that this kind of like radically progressive ideas of faith doesn't come just from communities like us who have left traditions on our own. I'm reminded of people like Richard Rohr, who
yeah,
is a Catholic priest and specifically a Franciscan friar, and who is like one of the most progressive voices. And I think about how he talks about the universal Christ as this idea of, you know, Christ is not just the person of Jesus, the historical person of Jesus, but this idea of God, of the divine's a connection to the divine in and through everything and all faiths and traditions, and like available and accessible everywhere. And so even though he is a devout Catholic, kind of like you talk about how this is the language that we speak, he would never advocate for somebody to become a Catholic.
right.
He would, he's like, what is your tradition? Where do you find hope? Anything that's leading you towards these ideas of love and justice and peace and wholeness, that is the divine in and through us. And so he's very much a connection to the divine in your own space and in your own journey. And it's one of the things I think so interesting about mysticism is that it gets so weird the further you get into it, but there's these core principles that everything ultimately leads to when you're seeking after, you know, making the world better and people more connected. And yeah, I don't know. I like that it holds to a higher tradition too. It's not just like get rid of the stuff that we don't like. It's
Yeah. No, I think one of the things I really want to talk about soon here is this recognition that the things we actually do with our bodies, and including the religious traditions that we practice, are absolutely integral to having a, a real and deeper experience of the divine. And I guess when I haven't fully articulated this out myself yet, but there is this very important understanding of one must have certain physical things they do, and I'm going to use the word spiritual practice, but that can look a lot of different ways. One really must, I think, have a certain investment in in space time and physically doing things in order to have these higher levels of consciousness and awareness and experience of the divine and God in our lives. It's not enough just to say, "No, I'm just going to deconstruct everything, leave everything behind," and then not have any way that we actually work this stuff out somatically with our bodies, and figuring that out myself. But when you look at Paul, Paul had an actual like mystical experience on the road to Damascus where he was struck blind according to his own testimony. He had a psychotic break, and it looks like a nervous breakdown. And you understand the fact that he was out literally hunting people down, inflicting trauma and doing violence in people's lives. And I'm not convinced he was a proper psychopath or sociopath. So eventually he had an emotional break because of this. And he calls it, I saw Jesus come down in a light and I lost my sight. But it took him from being Pete Hegseth to this new person. But it takes trauma in order to have these spiritual revelations. It takes trauma so often to have these spiritual epiphanies. And the trauma of this community has been deconstruction and the loss of faith from the God we grew up with. I mean, most of us here, not all of us, but most of us went through something traumatic. A world died for us. Our world collapsed. And I don't think we fully explore how that has been a spiritual experience, a somatic, call it whatever, a bodily spiritual experience for us. And I think for me it has been, and I'm still kind of coming to terms with what that means. And I've become more of a mystic, I like to say, over the years. But I want to affirm that here for us. Deconstruction's great, but I don't want it to be all up here. I want it to be in here, because I think it is. The trauma and spiritual revelations go hand in hand. They just do. And I want to explore that more. And the shared trauma of a community like this one, the trauma of the death of God, the death of the God we grew up with. It's a kind of Damascus Road experience for us, I think. And I want to explore that more, because I think part of what it means for us to be a spiritual community is to talk about what it means to experience the divine now in our bodies. And I don't know, I'm working that out. Anyway, because I'm guilty of living up here too much and theorizing. But for me, I'm just telling you about my own inner life a little bit. It may seem when you listen to Aaron, it's all this theory. No, there's stuff going on in here. There's stuff going on in here. There's stuff going on emotionally for me. And for me, that's how I experience this spiritual dimension of God in my life now. And I experience that during the week in different ways. And for me, it's beautiful. And I don't want to be too theoretical. Anyway, enough said about that. I got a little emotional there, but yeah, I don't want to lose touch with that. Anyway, we can explore that more. Other thoughts today? All right. Well, good stuff. It's 11:30 on the nose. Let us conclude our time together with this joint affirmation and benediction. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves, as Christ did, to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace of this life, this world, and each other. Amen. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you to all of you who participated online or listened to the podcast later. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.